For 8 years, the silence of the high plains had been Tobias Redmont's only companion. A heavy, suffocating blanket that he wrapped around himself to keep the memories at bay. He lived in a self-imposed exile, speaking only to the wind that howled through the canyons and the horses that grazed in his paddock, creatures that demanded nothing from him but hay and water. His ranch, perched on a rise that overlooked the sprawling, empty territory, was less a home and more a fortress. Against a world he had long since forsaken. The wooden shutters of his cabin rattled violently against the onslaught of a storm that had been brewing for days. The rain hammering against the oak like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry god. Inside, the fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock his solitude, illuminating the empty chair where his wife, Sarah, used to sit, and the dusty corner where a crib had once stood. Tobias sat by the hearth, his rough, calloused hands working methodically on a piece of leather tack, mending a bridle that had snapped during the day's work. The rhythmic scrape of the awl and the hiss of the fire were the only sounds he allowed in his life. A predictable cadence that kept the chaos of the past from breaking down his door. But that rhythm was shattered by a sound that didn't belong there. Desperate, urgent knocking that cut through the roar of the wind. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor passing through. It was the frantic pounding of someone with nowhere left to go. Tobias froze, the leather strap still clutched in his hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. No one came to the Redmont ranch. Not anymore. Not since he had buried his family and erected a wall of hostility between himself and civilization. That was far more impenetrable than his barbed wire fences. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by voices raised above the gal voices speaking a language he recognized instantly. Though he hadn't heard it spoken in years. Apache. The syllables were sharp and guttural, triggering a cold wash of adrenaline that flooded his veins. The last time he had heard that tongue, the world had ended in smoke and blood. His hand moved instinctively, muscle memory taking over where rational thought failed. Reaching for the Winchester rifle mounted above the mantel. It was a reflex. Born of nights spent sleeping with one eye open, a lingering scar from a time when trust was a fatal mistake. But as his fingers closed around the cold steel of the barrel, something stopped him. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a peculiar quality in the voices outside. They weren't shouting war cries or barking demands. They sounded like broken prayers, carried away by the wind. He approached the heavy oak door, his boots thudding softly. On the floorboards, every instinct he had cultivated over 8 years of isolation, screaming at him to bar the door and extinguish the lamp. But through the thick wood, he heard them more clearly, now women's voices. Urgent, terrified, and hushed. Then, one voice rose above the others, speaking English with a precision that sounded as if each word had been carefully carved from stone to ensure it was understood. Please. We know you are there. We need shelter. Just for tonight. Tobias pressed his palm against the rough wood, feeling the vibrations of the storm and the desperation on the other side. He thought of Sarah, of her relentless belief in the goodness of strangers, a belief that had ultimately gotten her killed. Kindness separates us from the animals, she used to say. But Sarah was dead, and Kenneth was a ghost he wasn't sure he could afford to resurrect. They are coming, the voice cried out again. Closer now, as if the speaker had pressed her forehead against the planks. If you do not help us, we will die out here. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die too. The threat wasn't delivered with malice, but with the cold, hard certainty of a prophecy. Tobias's hand hovered over the heavy iron bar that secured his sanctuary. For 8 years, that bar had been his boundary line, the physical manifestation of his refusal to engage with humanity. Lifting it meant letting the world back in. It meant consequences. It meant danger. But the terror in that woman's voice had pierced his armor. With a groan of rusted metal and resigned fate, he lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The sight that greeted him would be etched into his mind forever. 10 Apache women stood huddled on his porch, the rain plastering. Their dark hair to their faces, their traditional dresses torn and heavy with mud. They were a tableau of exhaustion and trauma. Some bore fresh wounds that bloomed dark red against the wet fabric of their clothes. The youngest, a girl who looked no older than 16, clutched a bundle to her Cheshire baby, silent and barely moving in the freezing damp. But it was the woman who had spoken who commanded the space. She stood slightly apart from the huddle, her chin raised in defiance of her exhaustion. Blood trickled from a cut above her eye, mixing with the rain, but her gaze was steady, locking onto Tobias's with a ferocity that made him step back. "I am Ayana," she said, her voice steady despite the shivering of her companions. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days." Tobias stared at them, the rain soaking the floorboards of his entryway. Questions swirled in his mind. Where had they come from? Who was chasing them? Why? His ranch. But then his eyes fell on the baby's pale, blue-tinged lips, and the interrogation died in his throat. He stepped aside, a silent invitation that broke the seal on his solitude. "Come in," he heard himself say, his voice rusty from disuse. They moved quickly, filing past him like shadows seeking the light, bringing with them the smell of wet earth, ozone, and the metallic temps of blood. As they entered the warmth of the main room, his cabin, once a cavernous echo chamber for his grief, suddenly felt small and crowded. The women clustered near the fireplace, the firelight catching the fear in their eyes. Ayana was the last to enter. As she passed him, she paused, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of betrayal. "The soldiers who hunt us," she whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. "They are not far behind. Maybe an hour. Maybe less. They will not stop until every one of us is dead." Tobias closed the door against the storm and slid the bolt back into place, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the bolt was useless now. The storm was no longer just outside. It was in his living room, and it brought with it a violence that would demand a reckoning. "Why?" Tobias asked, turning to face her, his hand still resting on the iron latch. "Why are they hunting you?" Ayana looked at him, and in her expression, he saw a mirror of his own past, and the look of someone who had lost everything but the will to breathe. "Because we ran instead of dying quietly," she answered, her voice hardening. "Because we chose to live when they expected us to accept death? Because some of us fought back when they burned our village and killed our men." She gestured to the young woman with the baby, whose eyes were wide with terror. "And because one of their officers will not see mourning if we live to tell what he did to my younger sister?" The implication hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Tobias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the type of men she was describing, men who wore the uniform of the United States. Army Bert had long since abandoned any code of honor. "How many?" he asked, his mind already shifting from shock to tactical assessment. 8, maybe 10, Ayana replied. "Led by a captain named Morrison. He claims we are hostiles, but his real enemy is anyone who might report what kind of monster he truly is." Tobias moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. The darkness outside was absolute, a void where anything could be. "Hi Denk." "There is a cellar beneath the kitchen," Tobias said, turning back to the group. "Stone walls. Hidden entrance. It might hold all of you, but it will be tight." Ayana shook her head slowly, a refusal born of grim logic. If they search and find us, you die with us, she said. If they find an empty house with signs that people were here, they might believe you are not involved. We will not make you an enemy of the United States Army. Tobias let out a short, bitter laugh that lacked any humor. 8 years too late for that conversation, lady, he muttered, walking toward the gun cabinet that he hadn't opened since the funeral. I became their enemy the day I decided to live past what they did to my family. The only question now is whether we run or whether we make them pay for coming here. Tobias unlocked the gun cabinet, the glass doors swinging open to reveal the ghosts of his past life arsenal of Winchesters, a double-barreled shotgun, and 2 Colt Navy revolvers that hadn't seen daylight since the treaty was signed. The smell of gun oil and old steel wafted into the room, a stark contrast to the scent of wet wool and fear that currently permeated the cabin. He didn't say a word as he began pulling the weapons down, checking the actions with a muscle memory that defied the years of neglect. He turned to Ayanna, holding out a lever-action rifle. You said you fought back, he stated, not as a question, but as a challenge. Do you know how to use this, or are you just going to make noise? Ayanna took the weapon, her grip firm and practiced. She checked the chamber and snapped the lever shut with a fluid motion that told Tobias everything he needed to know. My husband taught me to shoot before he taught me to weave, she replied, her eyes hard. And the soldiers taught me not to miss. She turned to the other women, speaking rapidly in Apache. The transformation in the room was immediate. The huddled, terrified refugees vanished, replaced by a grimly determined unit. Even the younger girls moved with purpose, overturning the heavy oak table to create a barricade in front of the main window, while others began extinguishing the oil lamps, plunging the cabin into a gloom illuminated only by the dying embers of the fireplace. The cellar, Tobias ordered, pointing to a rug near the kitchen. Put the mother and the baby down there. It's the only place the bullets won't reach. The young woman with the infant hesitated, looking at Ayanna. A sharp nod from the older woman sent her scurrying underground. As the trapdoor thudded shut, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from defensive to predatory. They were no longer prey waiting to be caught. They were cornered animals waiting to bite. Tobias moved to the window, peering through the slats of the shutters. The storm was raging harder now, the wind screaming like a banshee, masking any sound of approach. But then he saw a flicker of light in the distance, bobbing rhythmically. A lantern. Then, another. They're here, Tobias whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the metallic clicks of hammers being cocked. Outside, the lights separated, circling the house like wolves testing the perimeter of a campfire. The heavy tread of horses' hooves, squelching in the mud, became audible over the wind. A voice, booming and authoritative, cut through the storm. Tobias Redmont. We know you're in there. And we know you have guests. This is Captain Silas Morrison of the United States Cavalry. Open this door, and we can discuss this like civilized men. Tobias signaled for the women to stay low. He moved to the door, not opening it, but standing close enough to be heard. My guests are tired, Captain, he shouted back, his voice rough. And I don't recall inviting the cavalry to my land. You're trespassing. There was a pause, a beat of silence, where the violence hung suspended by a thread. Then Morrison's laugh drifted through the wood, a dry, humorless sound. Trespassing is a civil matter, Mr. Redmont. Harboring fugitives is a federal crime. These women are dangerous. They are murderers. Send them out, and I give you my word as an officer that no harm will come to you or your property. Ayanna crouched by the window, looked at Tobias. Her expression was unreadable, but her finger tightened on the trigger of the Winchester. Tobias looked back at the door. He knew what a soldier's word was worth out here in the Badlands, less than the mud. On his boots. "I saw the bruises on them, Morrison," Tobias yelled, his grip on his own rifle tightening until his knuckles turned white. "I saw the cuts. If they're murderers, it looks to me like they were acting in self-defense. You want them? You come. Get 'em. But you'd better bring more than just words." The response was instantaneous. There was no more dialogue, no more negotiation. The night erupted. The first bullet shattered the lantern hanging on the porch, plunging the front of the house into darkness. Then the windows exploded inward. Glass shards sprayed across the room like diamond dust as a volley of gunfire tore through the shutters. Tobias dove behind the overturned table, the wood splintering above his head as slugs slammed into the thick oak. "Stay low. Watch the flashes." He roared over the din dot. The women didn't scream. They returned fire. The cabin filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smoke of black powder. Ayanna was a force of nature, popping up from behind the sofa to fire 2 controlled shots into the darkness before ducking back down as the wall behind her disintegrated under a hail of lead. From the outside, screams of pain indicated that the women's aim was true. They weren't just spraying bullets. They were picking targets. Tobias crawled toward the kitchen window, the shotgun heavy in his hands. He risked a glance over the sill. Shadows were moving in the yard, trying to flank the house. He saw 2 shapes running toward the side of the cabin, carrying something heavy, torches. They intended to burn them out. Tobias rose, shouldering the shotgun, and unleashed both barrels. The boom was thunderous, shaking the floorboards. One of the shadows crumpled immediately. The other dropped the torch and scrambled back into the darkness, clutching his arm. "They're trying to torch the roof," Tobias shouted, reloading with trembling hands. "Don't let them get close to the walls." The battle settled into a terrifying rhythmly. Soldiers, realizing they had lost the element of surprise and that their prey was heavily armed, pulled back to the cover of the tree line and the barn. They began a suppression fire, a relentless barrage designed to keep the defenders' heads down while they maneuvered. The cabin was being chewed apart. Plates shattered in the cupboards. Pictures fell from the walls. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the firing stopped. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise. "Reload," Ayanna commanded, her voice cutting through the ringing in Tobias's ears. She was bleeding from a cut on her cheek where a splinter had struck her, but she didn't seem to notice. "They are regrouping. They will try to rush us." Tobias nodded, shoving shells into his shotgun. He looked around the room. 2 of the Apache women were wounded, one gripping a bleeding shoulder, another tying a strip of cloth around her thigh, but both still held their weapons. They were warriors, forged in a fire that Tobias had almost forgotten existed. "We can't hold them off forever," Tobias said, wiping sweat and soot from his eyes. "They have the numbers, and they have the ammo. If they rush all at once, they'll overrun us." Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the minimal light. "We do not need to hold them forever," she said. "Just long enough to make the price of our deaths too high for them to pay." Before Tobias could respond, a heavy thud shook the back of the house. They were at the kitchen door. The wood groaned as a battering ram, likely a fence post. "Against it! Back door!" Tobias yelled, spinning around. He and Ayanna ran toward the kitchen just as the door splintered. A soldier kicked through the debris, a revolver raised. Tobias didn't hesitate. he swung the stock of his rifle, connecting with the soldier's jaw with a sickening crunch. The man went down, but another was right behind him, leveling a carbine. Iona didn't fire, she was too close. She lunged, driving a knife she had pulled from her belt into the man's shoulder, twisting him around to use his body as a shield against the third man trying to enter. The gunshots in the confined space of the kitchen were deafening. The third soldier fell, hit by his own comrade's accidental discharge in the struggle. Tobias kicked the door shut and shoved a heavy cupboard in front of it, his chest heaving. "There. Testing the perimeter," Tobias gasped, leaning against the cupboard, looking for weak points. He looked at Iona, who was wiping blood from her knife on her skirt. There was a wildness in her eyes now, the adrenaline of survival taking over. "They found one," she said, pointing to the ceiling. Smoke was beginning to curl through the floorboards of the loft above them. The torch carrier hadn't failed completely. A spark had caught. The roof was on fire. "The rain," Tobias said, praying. The rain should put it out. But the smell of burning pitch told a different story. The fire was taking hold. They were trapped in a wooden box that was slowly turning into an oven, surrounded by men who would shoot them down the moment they stepped outside. Tobias looked at the trapdoor to the cellar. It was their only retreat, but if the house burned down on top of it, it would become a tomb. "We have to go up," Tobias said, looking at the ladder leading to the loft. "If we don't kill the fire, we're dead anyway." Iona grabbed his arm. "If you go up there, you're a silhouette against the flames. They will see you." Tobias looked at her, then at the women holding the line in the main room. "Cover me," he said. "Keep them busy at the front. Make them think we're all down here." He climbed the ladder, the heat intensifying with every step. The loft was filled with smoke. He could see the orange glow eating away at the shingles. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a storage chest and began beating at the flames, coughing violently as the smoke filled his lungs. Bullets punched through the roof around him, the soldiers aiming at the firelight. He was a shadow dancing in hell, fighting two enemies at once. He managed to smother the largest flame, the rain finally helping as it leaked through the bullet holes, hissing as it hit the embers. The silence that followed the detonation was not the peace of the empty plains. It was a physical weight, a ringing void, left in the wake of a sound so loud it seemed to have broken the sky. The front porch of the cabin was gone, reduced to a crater of splintered oak and smoking earth. The dynamite had done its work, collapsing the entryway and burying the first wave of Morrison's men in a tomb of debris. But the cost had been high. The blast had blown out the remaining windows and compromised the structural integrity of the main room. The roof was sagging dangerously, groaning under its own weight. Tobias lay prone behind the wreckage of the chimney, his ears bleeding, the dust coating his face like a death mask. Beside him, Iona was reloading her Winchester with trembling hands. Her movements slower now, hindered by exhaustion and the loss of blood from the graze on her cheek. They were down to the dregs of their ammunition, a handful of shells, and the last of the resolve that had kept them standing through the night. The storm outside had finally broken, the wind dying down to a mournful whisper, leaving behind a cold grey pre-dawn light that filtered through the smoke, revealing the carnage in the yard. "Is he dead?" Iona asked, her voice a rasp. Tobias peered over the pile of bricks. Bodies lay strewn in the mud, motionless shapes in blue uniforms. But movement near the tree line caught his eye. A figure emerged from the mist, walking with a pronounced limp, but moving with a terrifying determination. Captain Morrison. He had survived the blast, likely by using his own men as shields. He was holding a heavy revolver, his uniform tattered, his face a mask of soot and fury. Behind him, 3 more soldiers, the last of his command fund out, bayonets fixed. They were out of bullets, coming in to finish the job with cold steel. "He's coming," Tobias said, checking the cylinder of his Colt. 2 rounds. That was it. Get the others to the barn. Go out the back, through the kitchen hole. Take the horses. Iona looked at him, her eyes fierce. "We do not leave you." Tobias gripped her arm, his fingers digging into her sleeve. "You have a baby to save? I can hold them here for a minute. Maybe 2? That's enough time to get into the saddle." He forced a grim smile. "Besides, this is my house. I'm the one who has to clean up this mess." Iona hesitated, looking at the man who, hours ago, had been a stranger guarding his solitude like a dragon guarding gold. In the smoke and blood of the night, that solitude had been burned away. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of warrior's respect. Then turned and scrambled back toward the kitchen where the other women waited. Tobias watched her go, then turned back to the ruin of his life. He stood up, exposing himself above the rubble, leveling the Colt. "Morrison!" he roared, his voice cracking. "It's over! Look around you. You've got nothing left to command but a graveyard." Morrison stopped 10 yards away, signaling his men to hold. The captain smiled, a gruesome expression that split his blackened face. "I still have you, Redmont," he sneered, raising his revolver. "And once I step over your carcass, I'll have them." "You didn't win, you just prolonged the inevitable." "Inevitable is a word used by men too weak to change their fate," Tobias retorted. He fired. The shot hit the soldier to Morrison's left, dropping him instantly. Morrison fired back, the bullet whizzing past Tobias's ear, taking a chunk out. Of the chimney, the 2 remaining soldiers charged, screaming, bayonets leveled. Tobias fired his last round. It struck the second soldier in the chest, but the momentum carried the dying man forward, his bayonet slashing Tobias's forearm before he collapsed. Tobias dropped the empty gun and drew his Bowie knife, the heavy blade gleaming in the dawn light. He was empty. The last soldier was on him, thrusting the bayonet toward his gut. Tobias parried the steel clanging and stepped inside the guard, driving a knee into the man's stomach and the pommel of the knife into his temple. The soldier crumpled. Now, it was just 2. Tobias, bleeding and gasping for air, and Morrison, standing amidst the bodies of his squad. The captain holstered his empty revolver and drew a cavalry saber, the blade hissing as it left the scabbard. "Fitting," Morrison said, stepping over the debris. "An obsolete weapon for an obsolete man." He lunged. Tobias dodged, but he was slow. The saber tip sliced across his thigh. He stumbled back, crashing into the remains of the porch railing. Morrison didn't let up, swinging the blade in a vicious arc. Tobias ducked, the steel biting into the wood where his head had been a second before. He scrambled back, losing his footing in the mud. Morrison loomed over him, raising the sword for a killing thrust. "Die knowing you saved no one, Morrison." Sparta gunshot rang out, sharp, definitive. Morrison stiffened. A look of profound confusion crossed his face. He looked down at his chest, where a dark flower of blood was rapidly blooming over his heart. The saber slipped from his fingers, landing in the mud with a wet slap. He swayed, his eyes searching the distance, trying to comprehend the interruption of his victory. He fell to his knees, then face forward, into the dirt of the land he had tried to conquer. Tobias looked up. Iana stood on the roof of the barn, smoke drifting from the barrel of the Winchester. She hadn't left. She had climbed to the high ground and waited for the shot she promised she would take. The shot that ensured the captain would not see the sunrise. Tobias let his head fall back against the broken wood, the adrenaline crashing out of his system, leaving him shaking uncontrollably. It was over. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't threatening. It was the silence of survival. An hour later, the sun had fully crested the horizon, painting the high plains in brilliant hues of gold and amber, indifferent to the violence of the night. The survivors gathered in the yard. They had found 2 horses in the barn that had survived the stray bullets. The wagon was destroyed, and the house was a shell, but they were alive. The young mother sat on a crate, rocking the baby, who was miraculously sleeping. Tobias stood by the gate, his wounds bandaged with strips of linen. He watched as Iona adjusted the cinch on the saddle. She turned to him. "We will go south," she said. "To the mountains in Mexico. They say the bluecoats do not follow there." She paused. "You have no home left here, Tobias Redmond." Tobias looked back at the charred skeleton of his cabin, the fortress he had built to keep the world. Al was gone. The memories of Sarah were no longer trapped inside those walls. They had been released into the wind. He realized he didn't mourn the wood and stone. He had spent 8 years dying in that house. Last night, for the first time since the tragedy, he had lived. "No," Tobias said, looking at the horizon where the endless sky met the earth. "I don't know." He walked over to his own horse, a sturdy roan that had been spooked but unharmed, and swung himself into the saddle, grimacing as his leg protested. He looked at Iona, a question in his eyes that didn't need to be spoken. "Do you know the way to the border?" she asked, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I know the trails," Tobias replied, gathering the reins. "And I know where the water is. You'll need a guide." "We need a friend," Iona corrected. Tobias nodded slowly. "I can be that, too." They rode out through the shattered gate, a small, battered caravan moving slowly across the vast canvas of the plains. Behind them, the ruins of the Redmont Ranch smoldered, a black scar on the green earth. But Tobias didn't look back. He kept his eyes forward, watching the sun climb higher, warming the chill from his bones. The silence of the plains was still there, vast and ancient, but it was no longer his only companion. He rode alongside the people he had saved, and who, in turn, had saved him. The exile was over. The long walk back to humanity had begun.